Retail sales continue to outperform expectations in both the U.S. and in key European markets. Yet analysts are still waiting for that slowdown that was supposed to be driven first by inflation and then by higher interest rates. Yet consumers are proving resilient, but for how long? Long term, a lot seems to come down to the retailers themselves. Those with the right products and the right retail formats are likely to keep growing sales. So the question is, which retailers are set to be the winners? I'm Jane Singer, and welcome back to A Seat at the Table. In each episode, we sit down with some of the smartest and most innovative people who join us as guests on this show and share a ton of valuable business and life-enhancing insights. A big shout out to all of our esteemed listeners in 140 countries around the world. Thank you for being here with us today. Today we're joined by leading retail consultant Walter Holbrook, who shares his view of what's driving success at retail and who's likely to be the next retail success stories. Walter will be sharing key differences in purchasing behavior amongst the professional class, millennials, and Gen Z, and how retailers are catering to each demographic, how older fast fashion brands are responding to the shifting preferences of price-conscious Gen Z and the threat of newer market entrants, and how retailers like Costco are redefining the apparel market and presenting challenges to traditional retail channels. Another critical part of running a successful global business is understanding what's happening to your international supply chain. The last thing anybody wants is to be blindsided by an issue they didn't see coming, or miss an opportunity to drive cost savings or reduce lead times. When global sourcing directors want a sharp view of their Asian supply chains, they turn to the current situation in sourcing. It's a 6-page quarterly snapshot that highlights essential shifts, alerts, and opportunities, along with actual feedback about how other sourcing executives are reacting to the market. To learn more about the current situation in sourcing and to access the latest report, you'll find a link in the show notes for this episode. Now let's sit down with Walter and find out how we can get on the right track with retail. Walter, I really appreciate your joining us here on A Seat at the Table. I think that there is so much to unpack around retail these days. The situation seems a bit confusing, right? Because on the one hand, retail is performing fairly well. Consumers are spending. On the other hand, we continue to hear a lot of what you might call ominous signals. In general, what are you seeing on your side?
I think that the good news and the big picture is things are slowing. However, the consumer is there every day. They're shopping. Whatever money they have, they're trying to spend it. So, the economy has its challenges in different sectors. You look at it, 65% of the country is living paycheck to paycheck. That's tremendous pressure on them. And there's no doubt that the better income, the luxury customer, is driving a lot of business, but that's not keeping that everyday consumer out there looking for, let's say, needs versus wants.
Right. I mean, I think it's really interesting. And, on the one hand, yes, we hear that and it does make sense, right? That certainly prices for certain things have gone up, although it's being said that food prices are starting to come down and other prices are starting to come down. But at the same time, you're right, there are a lot of people who are living, essentially hand to mouth. But, when you look at it, you also see a lot of not what I would call luxury, because when we think of luxury, we think of the big international brands like Louis Vuitton, like Gucci, Dior, et cetera, but things that are more what you might call mainstream, but very pricey, that seem to be selling very well, right? Like all the concert tickets. I mean, obviously the biggest was Taylor Swift Eras Tour, but we could look at Beyonce and many other, that ticket prices are just staggering, plus travel to get there, sporting events, right? Ticket events, hundreds of dollars. How do you, and that's just experiences. You're also seeing things like those Stanley tumblers, right? Which were selling for like $45 minimum up to hundreds of dollars, and people are buying those things like mad. Where do you see that? How do you square that with what we're seeing in the market in terms of, this customer that's struggling from paycheck to paycheck?
Yeah, that to me, that is the apex here of the question. iPhones have become like rent.
Yes.
A car. You know what I mean? You either have an iPhone or you don't.
Right.
The Stanley Cup thing is just it's just crazy when you think that Yeti, everyone was nuts about Yeti just 2, 3 years ago, and now Stanley jumps in. Now, I would say I think most of those consumers are what I would call aspirational. You know what I mean? They're not going to go and necessarily be a Dior customer, but they'll
Right.
go to Target, they'll go to TJX, they'll go to Home Goods, and they'll look for value in a name brand.
So, in other words, when they see something they like, if I'm understanding what you're saying, they will spend the money on it. It's not as if they can't do it, even if they want it. If you make something they want, they will go for it.
Absolutely. And I think there's a little bit, one of my clients is an Ace Hardware that is in a very, very affluent area. And they carried grills up to $30,000 and $40,000.
Wow.
So there's an aspirational aspect as you move up the income level. And it's like, especially let's say with guys, let's pick on them instead
Okay.
of begs for the ladies all the time. But what kind of car is in the garage? Is it a Porsche? Is it a Mercedes? Is it a Ferrari? We see the same thing with these high-end grills. They want the newest, the best, all the features, and it's sort of like bragging rights for that aspirational shopper to be able to say, look what I just purchased. Average Joe, I don't think sees it quite like that, but
Right. Yeah, you don't realize it, but that's what they're doing. In other words, they have the money to do that when they see something that they feel will provide them with that satisfaction, whether that satisfaction is status or a better, use experience or so forth.
yeah, and especially I think would say you see that with the professional class.
Okay. That's really interesting because, you do see these higher end products in just about any category, right? Oftentimes outselling the less expensive ones.
Yeah, you can get a cup of coffee at McDonald's, but you can also get a cup of coffee at Starbucks or whatever. So, I
Right.
mean, the price differential is it's quite huge.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because a lot of people mentally feel that they're trapped in a certain, what you might call price box or price zone, and that people would never pay more, right? It's just always whoever's the cheapest is going to be the winner.
Yeah, you're still seeing too. I think when you look at the overall retail restaurant business, you're still seeing that the restaurant business is in pretty good shape.
Yeah,
That the consumer still likes to celebrate a little bit.
right.
That going out and having a cocktail or having a dinner once a week is still important to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's particularly relevant in a sense in the fast fashion sector because we've seen that, it was dominated really for such a long time by Zara, by H&M, right, by Uniqlo, brands, Primark, brands like that. And then suddenly, and they were sort of given a bad time, right, for being, low price and so on. And then suddenly Shein came into the market and laid waste to such a big share of the market. And then Temu has come in and also brilliantly successful at even lower prices. So, now it's forcing these brands to rethink. I mean, where do you think those, sort of older fast fashion brands, that's not really the right word for it, but you get what I mean. Where do you think they should be looking?
You know what? This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about in retail today, because I think what we're seeing in the apparel industry is amazing what's happening right now. You're talking about depressing prices. Prices are going down everywhere. And the consumer, if you look at the Gen Z consumer, they are very, very price conscious. They're all over TikTok. Now, those existing fast fashion like Zara, which Zara does an amazing job with visual merchandising, fashion, and at very, very reasonable prices. Primark's coming on very, very strong. That brick and mortar piece that those brands hold out allow that customer to have the shopping experience that they're not getting out of Shane or a TikTok or whatever. And that shopping experience is very, very important to the consumer.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that that was really undervalued for a lot of years when everybody was looking solely to e-commerce, right? And physical retail got kicked to the curb. What do you feel nowadays physical retail needs to do to make itself more energetic, more attractive, get itself back on that, upward trajectory?
Well, I think I have said this for years now, especially since the big e-commerce discussion of 4 or 5 years ago. The brick and mortar store has to offer an exciting, entertaining, emotional experience. It's that simple. And it's got to be based around compelling merchandise. And it doesn't have to be elaborate or expensive. I think of Five Below, what a tremendous job they've done the last 4 or 5 years. I see other things coming on. I'm thinking about TJX's new brand, HomeSense. It's been around for a long, long time. Now I think they're seeing it as $1 billion opportunity. Can it become another Home Goods? You
Mm.
walk into that store, if you're a decorator or if you're a designer, or you think you have those qualities, she loves that atmosphere. So get rid of the boring piece. The Macy's is just being hit over the head right now. And I love Macy's. God, the thought of Macy's being gone is crazy, but mid-tier apparel retailers are in trouble. And whether it's Macy's, Kohl's, or J.C. Penney's, how long can they hang on?
I think that's an interesting point. And everybody has talked for years and years and years about the fact that there is no middle, but you wonder whether consumers don't want mid-tier price things or whether mid-tier left the market, right? Did the consumer leave the market or did the actual product offering leave the market and left the consumer with not a lot? I don't know. What's your take on that?
Well, if you take Macy's, and Macy's is one of my favorite, and I don't go to New York, then I don't go to Herald Square. I always tell this story. Happened about 5 years ago, just before COVID. I was in Herald Square on the main floor, and I think it was Gillette was the CEO at the time. He had just gotten the job, and he's walking with the board through the store. I don't introduce myself. I'm just a customer, but our eyes met, and I said to him, "Don't you think Amazon would love to have this excitement in their store today?" The issue with Macy's is that excitement is only in a handful of stores.
Right.
And then that's where I always say, look what Target did the last 10 years and look what Macy's did. Target is as exciting, entertaining, emotional, compelling as any brand out there. And it's exactly what Macy's could have been. So that's the frustration there. Kohl's, I struggle with Kohl's a little bit. Everything is 40% off, similar to Macy's. J.C. Penney's just said they put $1 billion back into their store. I did take a look at one of their new layouts. It's gorgeous, but is that enough? I just don't know that it is.
Right, right. So do you feel, and I know it's a tough call, but do you feel it's more about the in-store experience for these, what you may call mid-tier retailers or brands? Or do you feel that the merchandise is lackluster? I mean, where do you find the excitement is missing?
Okay, so I get in trouble for this all the time from my apparel and fashion experts, all the time. And I keep pushing them. I said, if you haven't been in a Costco yet and look at how they're handling apparel.
Right, right, right.
I understand fast fashion's coming at you. But if you haven't studied Costco, it's not much different than Kmart was 50 years ago.
Mhm.
Stacking it out on tables, on trend to a certain extent. Costco's doing a fantastic job with brands, and their price points are $10, $15, and $20. They're not worried about fast fashion at all. They've already addressed it. Now, they're not getting that Gen Z juniors, the old juniors customer, that their fashion's changing in a second. But boy, the millennials and the boomers are having a field day with, I bet they're doing 15 billion in apparel right now.
I think you're right. I was just in a Costco a few days ago, actually, here in New York City. And you're absolutely right. The apparel is really impressive. The price points are not rock bottom, but they're definitely value. Yeah, definitely. And I think that brings another important point. I think that, yes, Gen Z is an important demographic to address, but I think that there's two perhaps critical opportunities people are overlooking. One of which is, of course, a very big demographic that's older than Gen Z and perhaps has more money to spend, actually. So they're not going to be as shoehorned into fast fashion or to the very cheap end of fast fashion. And I think also the fact that some of the values that Gen Z holds, and people say, we have to connect with Gen Z, we have to get them on board because they're the future. But their tastes could change as they get older, right? And move into different parts of their life, like getting a job and having a salary.
Yes. Like all of us, they're going to grow up.
Right.
But I think to your point is when you talk about values by a generation, I was watching it, and I'm a few years older than my wife. We were watching Mad Men. We absolutely loved Mad Men. And I lived during that era, and she did not. And there's a scene in there where they're out having a picnic, and they take all the trash and they just throw it in the park, right? And no one's thinking anything. And I said to my wife, I said, that is before America Beautiful had taken over. Once that happened, you never thought about throwing your trash out like that. Hey, the Gen Z talks about sustainability and environmental friendly, and then they go out and spend money like crazy on TikTok, Shane, and so they're not living their values yet.
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it. Yes.
It may happen, but they're not living it yet. It's still a price conscious business, and if you look at their incomes, you would understand why.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Now, when you look at product, because obviously product always is a key factor, right? It's price, but it's also product. There's been this big shift for, I would say, probably a decade, maybe more, of everybody going towards athleisure, right? Everybody wanted that aesthetic, particularly the pandemic really, really heightened that. Now we're seeing a lot of those brands are sort of facing headwinds. And I'm seeing, not necessarily from the US, but from the UK, brands that are selling more dressed up clothes, but at a mainstream price point, are reporting good earnings. What's your take on that? Do you think consumers' tastes have now shifted, that people sort of burnt out on athleisure and now want something a little bit different, or want something maybe more less dressed up or jazzed up? What do you see?
You know what? That's an interesting question. Viore, you think of Viore, Lululemon, those are very, very strong brands.
Yes.
And everyone is trying to knock them off. I mean, they're surrounded with knockoffs, but I don't see it affecting them per se. They still show pretty good earnings. Their sales are, for the most part, strong. I talked all the time about, what has become dress up in our society today. If you take a man's dress shoe, used to be a leather shoe. And now you've got a whole generation of men that think a black Nike is a dress shoe versus a white one. And you see shorts and flip-flops worn throughout the airports. So I'm not feeling the dress up. I wish I was. I love the idea of us dressing it better. You look back in the 60s and see the Yankee games or the hockey games, and everyone's dressed up in a tie and a shirt. I don't know that we need to go back to that. But
Right.
we're a pretty casual society.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting insight on that. I think most brands are struggling to figure out what's the right product right now in order to win over that consumer in a market that's become increasingly competitive as not only new brands come in, but also the market becomes more globalized, right? Because you're competing against every brand from everywhere in the world, in a sense, can access every market.
It is, and I think you do see some brands like Olakai, the footwear, more a casual, beachy type, that is doing extremely well, holding up their price points, and they're playing to that millennial customer that probably has a little bit more money so to speak. But, you see Columbia. Columbia's always been a great brand. Once you go to Costco, they've got Columbia in there. They're trying to reach that consumer wherever that consumer's at.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to see how channels of distribution have become a lot more diversified. As you're saying, Costco has become a player in apparel, which we wouldn't have thought of, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, dude? 10 years ago, it was all about Macy's, and then they took over Macy's as far as apparel sales. So it's amazing. I think they really have stepped it up, to be honest with you. When I go into their stores, I'm amazed at the labels, the quality, the price point. They've got it down right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Who else do you see as a challenger coming onto the scene?
Well, there's some, you get back to that. What's that exciting concept? I'm a huge fan of, are you familiar with Ollie's? The off-price, they have 500 stores.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're more of, let's say, a lower-end Marshalls, and they're growing like crazy out of Pennsylvania. I think they're at 500 stores. I think there'll obviously be a $1 billion opportunity there. My gut tells me that Buc-ee's is already there. I mean, the volume they're doing out of those 50 stores has just got to be.
Yeah, they're really in a very interesting story of people who really had a vision that didn't copy everybody else. They saw something. How big are they in apparel? I mean, other than like souvenir type things.
It's funny, but I would not call them fashion in any sense. And it is more of, but you'll see people wearing the Buc-ee's sweatshirts all throughout the South. So There's a humorous aspect to it. Probably no different than Mickey Mouse or Disney, but it's more of a Buc-ee's. And it definitely has a cult feeling about it. The other one I see coming on that I probably haven't talked much about is Games. I don't know if you're familiar with Games. It's young Gabriel Brothers. It's out of...
Tell us a little bit about it. Yeah, tell us a little bit.
Okay, it's out of Morgantown, West Virginia. The founding family was the Gabriel Brothers, and I worked for them. I was an operations executive for them, like the chief operating officer, and I worked with the founding families. They eventually, after I left, they eventually sold off to an equity company. But today they're at 130 stores, and they just purchased Old Time Pottery, 30 stores. They just opened a new warehouse in Ohio. My gut's telling me they're going to be coming on really strong. They're a big box Marshalls, what they are. Full family, mostly apparel. They do have some home decor in it. They do have some food, grocery type items. But I think you're going to find the Games is an exciting new concept in the off-price sector, which is very, very strong right now.
What differentiates them?
A size? They're 3 times the size of, say, a Marshalls or TJ Maxx, and the complete family. And I think the selection, there's probably more depth to the selection than what you would find in a typical Marshall. Marshalls, you're maybe finding pieces. Here, I think they're probably having product made for them, and they're buying in bigger quantities.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I know that you quite champion off price. Where do you see that going? I mean, from your perspective, it has really done very, very well over the past few years. What's your take on the future?
I walked into one of the first home goods in Atlanta in the late 90s, and I was just overwhelmed. I mean, I could just see it. I said, the targeted female customer is going to absolutely love this. So 25 years later, 30 years later, I mean, home goods is TJX has got to be their number one volume piece of that pie. And can they make the new HomeSense, which the opportunity I see on HomeSense is if you get out and drive anywhere in the country, you are seeing millions and millions of apartments being built. So those apartments are going to be the first home for Gen Z. This is going to be the first home. How are they going to furnish that new home? You know, they're not going to the traditional furniture stores. Well, they could go to IKEA, they could go to Target, they could go to Walmart. I think that HomeSense has a huge opportunity if they put those in the right places.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. I think people are overlooking that aspect of things.
Yeah, if you're in the furniture industry right now, which is crying the blues for the most part. I mean, they went nuts during COVID. Now they're back to a more normal setting. When real estate being off right now, they're hurting a little bit. But if I'm in the furniture industry today, I'm looking at getting my price points down and reaching that Gen Z customer that's getting ready to set up house. That's going to be a huge opportunity. I don't see RH going after it, but IKEA will.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because IKEA has definitely been doing really, really well. They're certainly a company to watch in many different ways.
Yes, great company.
So you feel that HomeSense would be squaring off against IKEA in some respects?
Well, I think what they could do with HomeSense is they'll bring more style to it. They'll bring more fashion to it because it's a TJX company. They've already got the buyers in with home goods. And I've been in both stores. They're not that different. There's more furniture in the assortment at HomeSense, which I think plays into this new growth we're seeing in apartments.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting trend. When you get back to apparel, what do you see really in the off-price space? Where do you see growth opportunities? Like I said, it seems like there's been so much growth. Where do you go from here?
Well, just this morning, I went and visited a shopping center this morning that is transitioning. And that shopping center is 30 years old. It's in the bullseye of that aspirational customer. It used to be a Kmart center 30 years ago, but it's on the beach side. Today, it's got a Home Depot. Nordstrom Rack is opening tomorrow. J. Crew Factory is opening next. Body and Bath is opening next. And then TJ Maxx. And it's got a Trader Joe's. So here's a shopping center that's 30 years old with phenomenal demographics. And they are completely transitioning this to a modern off-price venue and keeping that customer, that very affluent customer on the beach, not driving out, let's say 10 miles to the big town center, which is 2 million square foot monster center, living center. So I think there's opportunities like that everywhere. There's opportunities, not just at the higher end. I look at the dollar store sector and I get very, very frustrated. I've been in numerous dollar stores throughout the year. Their biggest challenge, and I know they just made a change at CEO, they have not figured out how to keep their counters filled. They can't keep their shelves filled. The demand's there. They keep telling whenever they do their earnings statements, they always say that the demand's back, my customer's hurting. No, that customer's there every day. Their counters are in.
Why do you think that is? In other words, why do you think they're having trouble filling those shelves?
They have a business model that is very difficult to execute when you add the turnover, labor turnover, the amount of volume that they're doing. When Kmart went to the pantry concept in the early 90s, we had organizations that had associates that were 20 and 25 years old. And then we put in these pantries, which were small grocery stores. And then we're walking around looking at our associates and asking how many cartons per hour is that person getting out today? Are they getting out 100 cartons per hour? I think that's where Dollar General is. They've added all these grocery items, but their organization isn't in tune to it. At Kmart, we had to go to all-night replenishment to make it happen, like a grocery store. What would the volume be? What would the sales uptick be if they could just keep their counters full? It's a simple equation. I know it's not easy, but I think that's their challenge.
So in other words, you feel they lean too heavily into grocery, which is a very different kind of a replenishment.
Yeah, I think the grocery strategy that they're doing is the right strategy for those markets that are underserved. And here's where I see you talk about another alternative. If Dollar General, let's say, can't get this figured out, it's what I call sustainable execution.
Right.
They can't figure this out. Aldi will. They're in, I don't know how many different countries throughout the world.
Right.
They will figure it out and they will come in and eat their lunch. And they're on the move, 800 stores in the next 36 months? That's another one to watch on the U.S. side.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how new challenges are coming into the market, how existing players are perhaps overlooking opportunities. Looking back to the Dollar Generals, which is obviously a very different model, what do you think is the big opportunity that they're overlooking?
I think what I would love to see them do is test some stores. Maybe they are, who knows, test some stores where they just ensure that it's completely full every morning and see what happens. Is the uptick in sales enough to justify the increase in hours? That's what it's all about. You've got those stores so beaten down right now where there's one associate. They tried to put self-checkouts in those Dollar General. Well, now they've backed out of that. That was just ludicrous. And they're not the only ones that are, the whole idea that technology was going to save the world. I think the tech panacea, I think we come over that quite a bit. Just not going to happen.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the self-checkout has overall been a failure, I believe, at most retailers. For the ones who tried it, like you said, they're pulling out. A lot of other guys said, we don't even see this as something we want to stick our toe into at the moment. So I think you're right. I think technology is coming through in a big way, but not necessarily on the selling floor.
And in some ways, what technology needs to do, and I have a lot of contacts in the technology. The one thing they can do is sell you something. On technology, I always tell them, I don't need to know about it. I shouldn't have to see it. It should be effortless, efficient, seamless, and it just happens.
Good point.
The customer shouldn't even know about it. It just happens. And that's when you know you have the right technology. And it may be as simple as barcodes. I mean, my God, no one even questioned that today. But the self-checkouts, there was never a buy-in on self-checkouts from the operators at the business or the consumer.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. I'm seeing that myself. When I shop, certainly very few people will go to the self-checkout if there's not a huge queue over at the ones manned by people. I see that everywhere. And stores having problems, technical problems, not ringing up things. It's causing all kinds of losses. So yes, you're absolutely right on that. It's really interesting. There's so many things to be watching nowadays. Walter, you've shared so many interesting things. I know you're a busy man. I could sit here and talk to you all day, but I bet you have better things to do than be chatting with me. I just want to thank you so much for joining us here on A Seat at the Table and sharing your vast insights into this industry.
Oh, Jane, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be with you.